Note, the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Three Gimbals. Hey everybody, welcome back to Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. I'm your host, Benjamin Butler, and before I go any further, I would first like to address you may notice that the backdrop of this podcast and the camera quality is a little bit less professional than normal. I am on the road, so don't get used to it. Don't worry, everything is fine. We're going back to our regularly scheduled programming later, but did not want you to miss this episode right here. This is going to be awesome. It's kind of a continuation of a series that we've been doing, focusing on Chinese influence in Latin America, the Caribbean. And today the spotlight's going to be on Brazil. And joining me today are two faces. One of them you may know well at this point. I'm talking about Martin Brown, recent graduate. So shout out to you, Martin, for that. Been a great contributor, regular contributor on Navigating Imbalance up to this point. He'll be joining us for a conversation today. And I'd also like to welcome Carlos Ricaurte, who's a Master of Arts in Latin America and the Caribbean, student at FIU. He's worked directly assisting the Latin America and the Caribbean Center as a research assistant. And his research is primarily based around balances of trade in Latin America, sort of vis-a-vis major trading partners, and then the international political economy and Sino-Brazilian patterns of investment. So, Carlos, welcome to the show. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, jumping right into it, let's talk about it. So, in this episode, we've looked at some different nations in the past. We've looked at Ecuador, we've looked at Peru, and now we're going to be turning our attention to one of the giants of South America. I am talking about Brazil. Um, I think out of all places, this Brazil fascinates me when it comes to China-Brazil relations because Brazil's become a major regional power. They've been a part of BRICS for a little while now, and it seems like every year they're gaining more and more influence in the hemisphere. So, if you wanted to, Carlos, just to kind of start us out, give all of our listeners and our audience a little bit of an overview of kind of some of the major things that Brazil has going on right now.
Well, definitely, we're currently seeing the Lula administration, which is a bit more on the center left, which is traditionally more aligned with China and the BRICS. This comes after leaving several years of more like a China septic administration under Jair Bolsonaro. And now we're seeing essentially the broader strengthening of bilateral relations and trade between Brazil and China. This, although it stems back to the 1970s and 80s, it has gone specifically stronger recently, specifically because of the iteration of the COSBAN Forum, which is essentially a bilateral Brazil-China forum in which practically every few years, Xi Jinping, Lula da Silva, they send major officers from their administration to set up new agreements regarding trade, regarding agriculture, regarding technology, research. So what we're seeing right now in Brazil is the strengthening and further codependence that unfortunately shifts us away from them, as in the United States.
Okay, so the connection between Brazil and China has gone back for some time now, and it's only deepening year to year. Um, So how, like when we're taking a look at the types of exchange that's going on between China and Brazil, obviously a lot of export, Brazil being a very large producer of a number of agricultural products. So China has kind of increased their share of that trading relationship in terms of Brazilian exports, specifically in the agricultural sector. So one of those being soybeans. How did China come to dominate that soybean export market when with Brazil?
Well, the answer to that is pretty dual, right? It comes down to both private and public sector interests, right? Starting in their relations back in 79, 85, Brazil and China had very limited relations. However, by 1985, their overall trade swelled entirely up to 1.2 billion in 1985. most of that being soybeans. Why? Because China was essentially adapting the strategy of mass investment into Brazilian agribusiness, right? And now moving into Brazil proper, the Brazilian government has this major investment, like plans into ensuring that actual large scale farmers both have the investment from the Brazilian state and then sign agreements to export that soybeans, meat, and other food related products to China, right? Right now, China is by and large the major essentially endpoint of most Brazilian exports being at 31.3%, being practically one third of all Brazilian exports end up in China, right? And we essentially see that every major like agribusiness firm that is operating within Brazil has some sort of doings with Chinese firms, right? We're talking Rocha Comércio de Gerais, Olam Brazil, Cooperativa Agroindustrial, like all the major ones that work not only in soybeans but in like in meat, in coffee, in sugar. All of them already work with China in some shape or form. This not even taking into consideration like the whole like close cooperation that both Lula and Xi have so constantly. So essentially, it's a combination of both the private sector having a direct interest in wanting to work with China and China directly investing in that private sector in order to ensure that it kind of creates this codependence, right? Specifically considering that China as a huge market, right, just has all that it needs in order to ensure that Brazil becomes dependent on it when it comes to exports.
And just to jump off what Carlos was saying about those mass investments and those partnerships by China, it's not only from 79 and 85, but also even more recently, it's still occurring in the region where China's mass investing, such as in 2010, the Chongqing Grain Group, one of China's largest state owned grain firms, launched a 300 million plan to build a soybean industrial base in Bahia, Brazil, with the aims of controlling 100,000 to 200,000 hectares of farmland to build infrastructure for processing, warehousing, and logistics. And although there were a lot of backlashes of land grabs by Brazilian public and local governance, and Brazil's attorney general issued a 2010 directive tightening restrictions on foreign land acquisition. Um, this caused for the plant to have significant delays, and a revised contract was actually brought up, which included a crushing plant of 1.5 million tons of cooking oil annually, refineries, biodiesel facilities, and this whole new revised plan was supposed to have around $879 million in costs, which would be covered by the Development Bank of China. So it just really goes to show that although, yes, in the past, China has invested heavily, they're still investing today. And, a Reuters investigation found that nearly two-thirds of Chinese investment projects in Brazil face significant delays, but they still will invest billions into the region openly. And even then, apart from mass investing specifically in different agriculture planes, China's open and aggressively acquiring different agriculture companies operating in the region, such as in 2014 when GovCo led a consortium to acquire a 51% stake in Noble Agri, a global agriculture business worth $14.9 billion in sales with 45 different asset locations and operating in 29 different countries, especially in Brazil. But also in that same year, they acquired another stake in Nidera, a Dutch founded international agriculture business with a turnover exceeding $17 billion. So, it goes to show that not only is China looking to bypass the companies operating in the region through traditional brokers, but also they are going heavily into soybean consumption through international acquisitions and investments.
So this is a multi-layered, truly like there's so many layers to this, whether that's acquisition of land, acquisition of companies, and obviously the depth of the relationship being formed over years and years of collaboration, cooperation, import, export. But going back into history a little bit, I want to open this up to both of y'all if you'd like to take this question. But what was it that gave Brazil such a window of opportunity to work with China? Like digging back into history, the U.S. obviously has prioritized when it comes to foreign policy different parts of the world for much of the last 30 years. And I mean, largely, you could make the argument that Central and South America and the Caribbean in particular have not necessarily always been areas of focus. However, I'm curious as to how China was able to establish such a foothold in Brazil originally.
Well, it's two things, right? It's a historical question. The first thing is historically, the U.S. and Brazil had close ties, and then the U.S. aided in a military coup over Brazil, which caused a dictatorship. And in that the democratization process after the dictatorship, Brazil focused entirely on global South to global South partnerships because they knew that they had the resources to be able to be a leader in that economy. And going with global northern countries like the US put them in a bind that costed hundreds of thousands of lives in their country. And also, although there have been significant US contributions in Brazil after the dictatorship, financial crises like 2008 and COVID hit a well for a lot of these private and public businesses operating in Brazil from American or even European companies, right? When you're looking at Brazil, you can think back to 2016 when American company Duke Energy sold all of their hydroelectric assets in Brazil to China Three Gorges for $1.2 billion. It just not having the stability in the United States or Europe to be able to invest in those companies because they are financial wells for them and they go into debt, so they need to sell their assets to the highest bidder. And a lot of the times it isn't the highest bidder, it's the only bidder, being from China that's looking for actual investments in Latin America.
There's also the fact that we're seeing like a macroeconomic change within Brazil, right? Mentioning dogpiling, essentially what we mentioned about the military dictatorship, right? We saw a shift away from majority agrarian economy towards import substitution industrialization. What that means essentially is that Brazil itself is wanting to industrialize, right? And that normally puts it like kind of at odds with the United States, which is a traditional giver of industrial goods, if that makes any sense, right? So essentially, despite the fact that we're still number one by a lot when it comes to FDI in Brazil proper, what China is doing essentially is that they're targeting specific sectors of the Brazilian economy that need money, and they kind of fit the agendas of Brazilian policymakers. Green energy being practically the flagship when it comes to this, right? The Sino-Brazilian Business Council points up how literally the Chinese, what they're doing is that they're putting up to 68% of their total revenues into strategic regions of Brazil, such as the southeast, of ensuring that actual green energy can be done. Right. And it essentially ensures that they remain more competitive and more appealing towards both the Brazilian public sector and the Brazilian private sector. So it is essentially ensures that on both sides of the aisle, Brazil wants to keep taking Chinese funds because it means actual continuous investment into competitive sectors of their economy that they want to move out from because they're still heavily reliant on things like soybeans, like oil, like all these natural resources. However, they've been trying to move into things like such as automobiles, airplanes, and as such as like heavy industry type manufacturing. So the Chinese are essentially many times the only ones that are willing to provide like overarching like actual investment needed for this because the overall Brazilian economy has had this problem ever since the military dictatorship that if it wants to do anything else it needs foreign investment because of its very low actual purchasing power within Brazil proper.
But also to note, the green energy transition, although focused by Latin American nations and China, have had a lot of setbacks and delays, especially because a lot of these investments were hydroelectric dams, and now all over Latin America, you're seeing significant droughts occurring. So you see blackouts in Brazil. You're seeing those hydroelectric dams I mentioned earlier that were Duke Energy's now at their full production capacity because a lot of these rivers are being droughted, so they just can't function as normally. And there's been a big push now in automobiles, like Carlos said, but electric vehicles specifically. We've seen BYD, one of China's largest electric vehicle companies, investing heavily into Brazil, working with local partners to create the infrastructure to make sustainable solutions for their cars so that they can actually have a domination of the market. And they do. BYD holds 75% of the electric vehicle market in Brazil alone. Tesla is not there. Not a lot of other electric vehicle companies are there, and they're one of the top selling vehicles across the board. And that's due to the fact that BYD is working with local businesses, and they are also investing in areas like Minas Gerais in Brazil, which is becoming a growing lithium valley.
Working intensely with like already existing natural resources, right? Like the
Yeah.
ethanol industry, it's a rising industry right now. However, it comes from like the historic industry of the sugar within Brazil, right? But however, right now China is investing so much that up to 36.1% of their share is within Brazilian ethanol exports. So like essentially all the entirety of exports that Brazil makes of ethanol, all of that revenue comes from Chinese investment, 36.1%. So it's just telling how they're essentially making a strategic investments all over Brazil to ensure that they can expand their influence in the long term.
Got it. I did want to ask you a question based on something that you said about green energy. That's a point of emphasis for Chinese investment within Brazil. They've put a lot of money into this strategic sector. They've built the hydroelectric dams, or they've taken it over from other
Yeah.
nations' assets that have been sold off, right?
Yeah.
But there's drought. Now we're facing a unique problem, right? Do you think, and this could be your personal opinion, both of you know more about this than I do personally. Do you think that this strategic investment by China is going to pay off? Is it sustainable? Or is it a house of cards that may fall apart?
Energy sector alone is a lifeline sector. If you invest in that sector, you're not investing in a country's resource. You're investing in their lifeline, their functionality to live and prosper, right? So China's investments will most likely have a payoff in the future because those countries will become more dependent on Chinese investments more than ever now. Because not only do they hold your resources, but they also hold your lifeline, whether that be your technology or your energy and the ability to turn your lights on at night. And places like Ecuador that are seeing droughts and blackouts every day are in totality due to Chinese investments and acquisitions and putting all their eggs in one basket with the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, which is supposed to light up their houses and make up for 35% of Ecuador's energy needs. But that's just too much for one site. It's not that green energy itself is bad. It's the fact that how they're making it is making it so important of these specific sites that they are not looking at scenarios like we're facing now with droughts. Why don't we have more wind power or solar energy? You know, the Cauchari in Argentina solar plant is a huge success for Chinese investment, but that is a rare case to have solar plants throughout other Latin American nations. So why not just diversify your energy needs instead of just making them all one giant plot?
And to further develop on that, I would say that it's already paid off, right? These green energy investments have created an essentially a demand for further green energy products within Brazil, right? That has led to the balance of trade swelling, right? In 2021, $40.1 billion. Between 2024, of like 3 years of continuous investment, $74.5 billion. The balance of trade has risen immensely, mostly because essentially China keeps exporting the needed products in order to actually maintain these green energy initiatives, right? Because obviously these dams, these windmills, like all these, they require specific, not only human capital, but require specific like technologies that are not produced in Brazil. And therefore Brazil finds a way of essentially ensuring that this interdependence and specifically this dependence on technological goods is further strengthened, right? Because again, uh, Sino-Brazilian trade relations have always been in the sense of Brazil gives away natural resources, China gives back electronic goods or like manufactured goods. Well, the only thing that we're seeing now is that the balance of trade is swelling because we're seeing more trade due to China essentially investing into green energy and creating a long-term demand within Brazil for their own products. So I would say that this is definitely something that's paying off right now, and that if we do not do something about it, it's going to end up paying off many years in the future.
Soybeans and agriculture goods may be the top export that Brazil sends to China, but it is not. It should not overshadow the amount of iron or oil also being sent to China from Brazil. As of 2023, Brazil exported about $21 billion dollars worth of iron and minerals to China and about 20 billion in oil, which goes to show that not only is China extracting their own energy needs in oil, but also minerals to be able to make these finished goods to send back to Brazil so they can have the ability to make it on their own.
So yeah, that kind of leads me, and that's a valid point. That's something that I think is interesting that I would like to explore a little bit further. So Brazil, despite the fact that in their relationship with China may not be functioning as the finished goods producer, they have a fairly robust aviation sector. Like they're one of the only nations. I know they're one of the only nations in South America that is a player in the global aviation space with Embraer, and I mean, they can do passenger aircraft. They've done military aircraft and export with the Super Tucano series. Like they have some regional manufacturing capability. Have we seen China trying to leverage that in a way, or is China trying to, through their practices of importing the raw materials from Brazil and selling back finished goods, is China trying to stifle that, or are they trying to like what's the dynamic at play there?
Think it comes down specifically to like specific industries, right? Because essentially, you're essentially like talking about the matter of like if China actively like industrializing or helping industrialize Brazil, and the answer is kind of like in between, right? When it comes to the oil industry, for instance, due to resource extraction, it is allowing to some shape or form industrialization by making more refineries. More rig exploitation, like more stuff like that, right? When it comes to Embraer and stuff like that, we don't see as much direct investment. However, again, the Chinese are not exactly trying to stifle manufacturing in some shape or form. What they're doing essentially, they're trying to invest further so they can enhance their own control within specific sectors of manufacturing, such as green energy, such as green automobiles, like Martin mentioned. So it really goes down to specific sectors and why.
Got it. Yeah, I, I I would be curious to see how this plays out in terms of U.S. interests. What risks? I mean, assuming status quo for the next 5 to 10 years, right? If Brazil keeps traveling along this path, what would the end result for the U.S. be? Or how would we go about trying to reassert U.S. presence in Brazil with the current situation being what it is?
Well, I mean, when it comes to reasserting um, U.S. Um, influence or capacity within Brazil, we have to really look at our past mistakes, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the history, the financial crises. But we should learn forward from those issues, right? We shouldn't be going to Brazil on a matter of making strategic partnerships, but just growing regional relations to what they are now by making Brazil more aware of what they're doing, right? Whether that be having U.S. Southern Command and State Department going down and working not only with Brazil but other Latin American nations to create interagency screening mechanisms like we have in the U.S. with CFIUS, right, which has been widely successful, so that maybe not to ban or stampede on any foreign investment, but just so they have a way to actually regulate what is going on in their country. Of course, we're seeing Lula's administration push away from any hinting of an interagency screening mechanism, but if it's something that we could push further, not only to Brazil, but as maybe an extension of the Andean Union on the Pacific side. Also, when it comes to American companies themselves, um, for them to work with U.S. Based organizations like the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, it could aid in helping to maintain and stabilize any external investments into Brazil, whether that be in resources, in infrastructure, or in minerals, right? So that could be maybe two ways that we can look further for U.S. companies in the region.
I would also say to once again try and get on the same page as like Brazilian development goals, right? As we're talking right now, they're trying to diversify their economy towards green energy and heavy industry, right? And that's why they rely so much on China because they're like the one person actively trying to give them in these specific sectors, right? For instance, just in 2023, the Brazilian Development Bank, which is like the major state-owned development bank of Brazil, received up to $800 million from the Chinese Development Bank for development products, I mean projects all over Brazil, right? So we're still number one when it comes to direct FDI at 207 billion, but we're not using it in a way that actually ensures that we have these strategic investments. So what I would say is essentially reevaluating the way in which we invest in Brazil and essentially ensuring that we're doing it in tandem with the private sector and in tandem with long-term development goals of Brazil.
No, that makes sense. And I think it's those long-term development goals where we may see some of the disconnect. Segueing into the next segment of we have China that is working actively with Brazilian industry right now in building out that east-west infrastructure through the Amazon, where they're aiming to take some raw materials, goods from Brazil, get it to port in Peru, and ship it to China, cutting down an infinite amount of time in trying to sail around South America and being able to essentially transport from one side of the continent to the other seamlessly on a continuous railroad. Like that fits with I'm not saying that project, I mean that project has its issues and we'll talk about that, but in terms of strategic objectives that does seem to fall in line with a lot of the broader spectrum goals that Brazil has, and as well as obviously China's in it for themselves as well, because I mean it saves them money, right?
Oh, for sure. And this whole infrastructure project was a long-standing plan, really from the actually during the time of the military dictatorship did this plan come to light, to connect the Manaus to Pacific ports, such as at the time it was Batia, Manta, and Tumaco, but now of course also Chancay is the actual main goal, present day. And these Amazon routes are aimed to integrate roads and riverways to facilitate exponential commodity exports to Asia, specifically China, including the Solimões River, being dredged to be supporting a river-based cargo, to connect with Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And in this, you also have the Arco Norte project, which is partly influenced by Chinese demand and focused on improving transport corridors in northern Brazil, whether that be railways, highways, ports, or, like I mentioned earlier, river dredging. Um, and this whole Arco Norte expansion progress is going to cost at least $5.5 billion. And of course, you have the Brazil Peru Transcontinental Highway, with the main contractors being China Railway, One Engineering Group. Um, in the planning phases still, but worth $72 billion. And this really is going to exponentially increase the amount of goods going from Brazil to China, because currently in a maritime freight, a ship leaving the Paraguay port to Beijing will take about 40 days. But from Shanghai to the same port in Beijing, it'll take about 23. So if you make something in the middle at Mato Grosso, which is the target start location for the Transcontinental Highway, going to Shanghai, it may be around 30 days of travel instead of the usual 40 to get your shipments there. So this just exponentially increases Chinese exports of goods, by about a week.
This and making sure that essentially the actual costs when it comes to import and export are far cheaper, specifically since all the regions that are being targeted are major producers of the raw goods that China wants to begin with, such as oil and soybeans, right? Essentially, to build up on the idea of the Arco Norte, as Martin said, it is back to the military dictatorship. It essentially works on ensuring further connectivity around the Madeira, Tapajos, and Tocantins rivers. These are the three main rivers that, besides the Amazon, actually connect like the Amazonian region of Brazil of the Northeast with its coastline or its actual production based. So essentially, it'll ensure that the passage of anything from soybeans to oil to ethanol to everything is way cheaper. In fact, already the Brazilian government is already looking into up to 30% less like actual costs of moving soybeans from a place like Manaus all the way to like the Brazilian coast, of actually ensuring that the Chinese have to pay less and therefore can invest even more into the Arco Norte through obviously the Brazilian Development Bank, through the Brazilian Infrastructure Ministry, stuff like that.
Interesting. So this is very much, though, still in the planning phase of this infrastructure, this full connected infrastructure network, right, of transport. I mean, obviously, there's been some work done on some smaller projects with road improvement and things like that. But in terms of the Trans-Amazonian Highway, Amazon corridor concept, there's a lot still to be done. How, like, with the environmental concerns of doing anything in the Amazon right now, I mean, I can't imagine that that's something that China's going to be able to get away with, in the sense of there's going to be some pushback to doing this. Am I right?
I mean, there usually is pushback by local communities or even the governance, but in many cases, that hasn't stopped China from completing their projects. You look at Shanghai that had a whole list of different malpractices, whether that be um, accidentally flattening communities or explosions too near to civilian sectors or um, displacing thousands of people from their homes because the jobs are now gone in the fishing industry. But that didn't stop Shanghai from becoming operational. The Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam is operational, even though all the officials connected to it were on bribery charges, and it has had thousands of different issues in the plants themselves. So yeah, there are environmental social concerns, but that won't stop the construction of the project in the slightest.
Again, we have to understand that the Chinese are not just doing this because they can. Like, the Chinese are doing this with the full consent and backing of the national governments in question, right? So even if there is some sort of local or like, even regional backlash, at the end of the day, if it has the backing of the key powers needed, such as the Brazilian national government, the Colombian, the Peruvian, like essentially everyone who's involved, it'll happen anyways, regardless of the backlash, even despite that the environmental clashes it could cause are like catastrophic, right? Most studies point out that every single time that any Amazonian region country tries to like make a major development project, it always leads up to further malpractice, further mass forest fires, further like
Illegal
damaging.
lodging.
Exactly. Damaging of the biodiversity, since the Amazon already houses like one of the most biodiverse regions in the planet, so the environmental potential damages of this are not even
And not to
incalculable.
mention the displacement of indigenous communities operating in the Amazon.
This is also true. Yeah.
And what should also be considered in this question is China's main goal and strategy. Of course, yes, they do the green energy investments, whether that be energy or whether that be healthcare, housing. But at the end of the day, it's what they can extract from the region itself after they intertwine themselves and create a dependent economy with China, right? So this is a critical project for China because it allows them to have an exponential increase in exports of goods that are critical in their own technological growth and prowess, especially with their activities around the South China Sea and Taiwan Straits, increasing every single day. This is the type of project that they need 100% operational and completed.
The thing I think, though, that I don't want any of the audience to lose is the idea, like, what's it's the irony. The irony of the situation is China's investing all of this money into green energy. And you could easily make the statement of like, oh, well, they care about the environment. They really want to see a country develop differently than the Western colonial model of resource extraction and just generating finished products for whatever nation it may be, while keeping the other nation subjugated in a resource provider role. But the irony here is that it really was never been about the environment, obviously, because if it was, you wouldn't be doing this. And two, you could make the argument that it's almost the same as what some Western countries have been doing in places like Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean for many years. This is just the newer version of it,
No,
and with a
exactly.
different country doing
Absolutely.
it, right? Like that's what I mean. Sometimes it just like you go an inch deep and you're like, wait a minute,
I mean,
what's going on here? You
yeah, we
know?
can look at just cases outside of Latin America, for instance, in
Right.
Democratic Republic
Like
of
the
the
Congo,
Congo.
yeah.
In the
Right.
Congo, like China is the major importer of Congo's cobalt and other rare earth minerals, while also holding up to 40% of its foreign debt. What that means essentially is that 40% of the total foreign debt of the DRC is owed to China exclusively, out of the sheer amount of debt trapping that has been happening. So this is essentially just the same techniques, the same doctrines, the same mechanisms that were used before. They're simply just being used by China in an even grander scale, I would say, because they rely exclusively on the total like macroeconomic transformation of a country to simply just become like a satellite of China within that region. Venezuela as well, over 50% of its total oil is exported into China, right? While at the same time, Venezuela is the main receiver of total lending into being receiving up to 44% of its total loaning agreements into Latin America. So it's like, it's the same techniques over and over again in an even grander scale.
As we talked about in past episodes, with Ecuador and the Peru episodes, China is also extremely active in their space regarding their infrastructure of mining operations, right? Like the Las Bambas in Peru and Mirador in Ecuador. China is the main importer of Peruvian copper. It's 70% of all Peruvian copper. Also, with Chile, China imports 74.1% of all Chilean copper and 72% of its lithium manufacturing. So this just goes to show that, yes, China is going to do green energy investments, but they're also just going to go attract the resources that they can at the same time.
For sure. And we've only lightly touched on these topics in this episode, but I haven't even gone into obviously we could kind of rehash the telecom industry. We could talk about the mining, we could talk about this, we could talk about that, but we've already spent so much time talking about it in Ecuador and Peru, and it's like these things are happening all over. Everywhere you look, it seems that China has its hands in things in those sorts of extractive industries, right? Um, and in port infrastructure and airports and investment into large things like that, large infrastructure projects, broadly speaking. Um, so to kind of put a bow on this from a strategic perspective, right? From a geopolitical perspective. So, what should, like, in the US, what should defense intelligence professionals, analysts be monitoring right now in regard to Brazil and China? Like, what do we need to be paying attention to?
We need to see not only the extraction of these minerals, but the rate of return it has on their technological growth inside of China itself, right? Because we see that, yes, they're taking these resources, they're making their electric vehicles, they're making their technology, but we need to see how this is affecting their technological research and its growth itself. And if there's any correlation to any um, Chinese military activity in creating new weapons of power, just like you have the rumors and satellite images showing that China's making their own nuclear aircraft carriers. We need to see where they're getting the materials from and how much they need to make those type of technological advancements. So focusing on regions like Minas Gerais, regions like Ecuador, Peru, on the transcontinental transportation system we are talking about earlier, to show and see how that will exponentially increase their trade. Soybean, and of course, the growth of oil exports, because a lot of military vehicles do need them to operate.
I would say that we have to look specifically, like defense and intelligence has to look and essentially if the undoubtful economic influence that China has can actually bleed is actually starting to bleed into political and security-based influence in Brazil. It's already bleeding into political, as BRICS is essentially, when it comes to Sino-Brazilian relations, is stronger than ever now. China and Russia are already calling, for instance, for Brazil to have a seat like as a permanent member within the United Nations Security Council, which would be a huge reform to how the UN actually works internally, and it would be like a huge milestone when it comes to political influence within Brazil. And secondly, actually look into specific collaboration with those like strategic firms like Embraer that we mentioned, right? Essentially ensuring that if we're seeing that if this economic influence is actually moving into influence within the Brazilian defense industry right now, because the defense industry is kind of on a rise right now, despite that it's only 3.5% of the total GDP. It's actually rising when it comes to exports, not just to South America in general, but like even across the world. Embraer is working with like Swedish companies, with the European companies. So it's essentially like it's a rising sector, right? So something that defense and intelligence has to look at is specifically be like, how is this economic influence bleeding into influence with working with these firms? Because if they start working directly with these firms, then it means already it's not looking too good when it comes to preserving our own influence within Brazil.
Right. And this is the classic, are we going to wait until something happens to do something? Or are we going to be proactive and really working to establish a better relationship, with countries like Brazil, and I think that's kind of the game is are like weighing obviously I'm not a decision maker in that regard, but I think leadership definitely would need to be thinking about those things. Are we going to take a proactive stance, or are we going to take a reactive stance? And I would say, you could just look at some of the evidence. You could look at what's happened in some other places, and you could say, hey, you know, yes, the proactive stance may cost more in the short term, but what is the end result? And I think that's a decision that needs to probably be weighed out by the people who have that kind of power.
For sure. And Latin America is a region that the U.S. shouldn't take reactively. We need to be proactive in the region because these Latin American nations need foreign investment to be able to have a better economy, but they're not going to go and beg for it anymore. We have to go in the region, actually get our hands dirty, communicate with the locals to see their needs and aid them in meeting those requests.
Right.
Yeah, we
All
have to
about
understand
value.
Latin America is still a region that is willing to work with the United States and should continue working with the United States. Like, it's not a region that simply because of its bilateral history is willing to just abandon the United States. Like, there's still the balance of trade with the United States remains strong, FDI remains strong, bilateral relations with specific member nations, they still remain strong, right? It's just a matter of actually using these assets to our advantage. So it's not like it's already over. We just have to, like, essentially reevaluate how we're going to go at it.
A lot of times, these investments by China aren't, oh my God, China's the highest investor. No, they're the only investor. Like there needs to be an understanding that a lot of these cases is U.S. and European companies leaving the region, leaving China to be the only investor in these projects, which is why Xi Jinping came out and said, "I want small but beautiful projects," because China had too many investments. They couldn't keep up with their own financial gains. And so they need to take a step back because they realized that there were such large holes and voids in the regions because US companies and European companies were not being proactive.
Got it. Yeah, and I also think a kind of second component of that is the information and the publicity piece to it. I think one thing that China has done is in countries like Peru, they've essentially leveraged very deeply their relationships with local media and their investments into that whole communication sector of, okay, creating stories, narratives that are favorable to their interests and that will support their infrastructure based investments, right? Whereas in the US, some of that isn't necessarily as visible. And I think amplifying the things that we do well, sometimes, I mean, that could serve us moving forward in terms of like, how are we celebrating and amplifying the voice of the people who we have relationships with in these nations, versus letting someone else control that narrative, I
No,
guess.
exactly.
Definitely, it's a PR battle. That's why
Yeah.
it's a pure battle that essentially the United States has to keep fighting. The United States does have some fair and fairly large, I'd say, anti-American sentiment in the region. However, again, it doesn't mean that this represents the entirety of the Latin American electorate or public. It just means that it's a very politically active sector of the electorate that leads to these policies being made. However, again, it's a PR battle that the United States can and should keep fighting.
Yeah, no, well said. I wanted to thank you guys both for your time as we kind of wrap this up, land this plane here, so to speak. But guys, really appreciate your contribution to the conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next couple episodes as we keep going down this little series we have going on here, focusing on Chinese influence, investment, policy, attitude towards Latin America and the Caribbean. I think you guys are going to be pretty excited about some of the stuff we have working in the pipeline right now. But for now, thank you for tuning in to Navigating in Balance. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify. We do have a LinkedIn page as well attached to Three Gimbals, Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. So go follow, go like, go subscribe, go comment. Everything helps. And if there's anything that the audience, if you want anything in particular you want us to speak about, have a conversation with people in a relevant field or industry, please don't hesitate to let us know. We've got our new intake form that's live and it's up. We posted about it on LinkedIn. So go fill that out, go distribute it to your professional network. And with that being said, guys, thank you very much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.